This is my second character of Ancestor League. It's been so much fun for me to play and optimize that I've just hit level 100, and it hasn't even felt like that much of a grind. I've just been blasting maps and not dying. The character is my own spin on the well-established Poison Molten Strike Pathfinder that's existed since at least Heist League. You may be familiar with Poison Molten Strike already, but what sets this build apart from other Poison builds is its investment into non-damaging ailments through Leadership's Price, Affliction charges, and Fury of Nature. It's also, of course, very heavily invested in defensive layers, in this case revolving around Mahuxotl's Machination and tempered by War. Let's start with how I'm scaling my damage. According to Path of Building, fully buffed, I deal 9 million Shaper DPS with the melee attack and 4 million Shaper DPS with each of my 10 projectiles. I'm not sure how many of the 10 projectiles are hitting on average against bosses, so I don't know how to accurately estimate my total DPS. All I know is that it's enough for me to take on uber bosses, which is not something I can say for most of my builds. The build uses a pneumatic dagger, an experimented base type from Grand Heist that causes all damage dealt by the weapon to inflict poison. If you're not sure what that means, here's a quick explanation. Normally, when you inflict poison, the base damage of poison is proportional to your base physical and chaos damage. With a pneumatic dagger, all base damage contributes to poison, including elemental damage. This also means that any modifiers to elemental damage, such as elemental damage with attack support, will apply to my poison damage, or at least to the portion that comes from base elemental damage, which is essentially all of it. This build has a number of sources of flat elemental damage, including the local modifiers on the weapon, the Wrath Aura, the Molten Strike Gem, and 2 ring prefixes. Other important sources of damage scaling include damage over time multiplier, poison duration, and additional projectiles. I use many sources of damage over time multiplier, including several that only work with critical strikes. With high crit chance, I scale dot multi higher with perfect agony, which applies crit multi modifiers to dot multi. Poison duration is scaled mainly through the Awakened Unbound Ailment support gem, but also through some passive tree investment. Molten Strike's DPS also scales well with projectile count, and this build has 10 projectiles per strike. Beyond that, I use your typical damage scaling avenues for attack builds, like increased damage, increased attack speed, and multipliers wherever I can find them. One unusual multiplier that this build uses comes from Affliction charges, which come from the Olesia's Delight unique belt. Affliction charges replace Frenzy charges, and instead grant 8% more damage with ailments and 8% more effect of non-damaging ailments. I have 6 Affliction charges, so that comes out to 48% more poison damage and 48% more non-damaging ailment effect. The non-damaging ailment effect is also core to this build. More on that later. In terms of debuffing enemy defense, I use Despair and a belt enchantment to lower enemy chaos resistance. Additionally, thanks to the Pathfinder Ascendancy, I apply Wither on hit. The 135% increased chaos damage taken from Wither and the 50% increased damage taken from Shock stack for a total of 185% increased damage taken from my poison. Now let's go over how the build uses non-damaging ailments to scale both offense and defense. My amulet is Leadership's Price, which grants me Scorching Conflux, Brittle Conflux, and Sapping Conflux as long as my 2 highest attributes are equal, which they are. If you're unfamiliar with the alternate ailments Scorch, Brittle, and Sap, they're all non-damaging ailments associated respectively with fire, cold, and lightning damage. Scorch lowers elemental resistances, Brittle adds crit chance to incoming hits, and Sap lowers damage dealt. There are relatively few ways in the game to apply these ailments, and they often come with the downside of making you unable to apply the regular ailments, which are Ignite, Chill, Freeze, and Shock. Leadership's Price is no exception. Historically, the most common way people have applied these alternate ailments has been through the Secrets of Suffering keystone, which comes from either the unique cluster jewel, the Interrogation, or the alternating Scepter experimented base type. Leadership's Price has a higher opportunity cost than Secrets of Suffering, requiring the very competitive amulet slot and a lot of headache balancing 2 attributes. However, Leadership's Price has some advantages over Secrets of Suffering that are often overlooked. Let's first establish how Secrets of Suffering works. Like Leadership's Price, Secrets of Suffering makes you unable to inflict the default ailments. When you crit, Secrets of Suffering causes fire damage to inflict Scorch, cold damage to inflict Brittle, and lightning damage to inflict Sap. If, for instance, you crit for 100 physical damage, 100 fire damage, and 200 cold damage, then you will inflict Scorch based on the 100 fire damage and Brittle based on the 200 cold damage, and you will not inflict Sap because you deal 0 lightning damage. Leadership's Price, on the other hand, grants Scorching, Brittle, and Sapping Conflux. What Conflux means is that all of your damage inflicts the respective ailment. With all 3 Confluxes, all of your damage inflicts Scorch, all of your damage inflicts Brittle, and all of your damage inflicts Sap. Using our previous example, you would inflict Scorch based on 400 total damage, Brittle based on 400 total damage, and Sap based on 400 total damage. It's much easier to scale the effect of all 3 ailments when all damage scales all ailments. Conflux also means that you have 100% chance to inflict the ailment, regardless of whether you crit. This means that unlike Secrets of Suffering, Leadership's Price can be used on non-crit builds. That caveat doesn't matter here though, since I'm playing a crit build anyway. My goal when theory crafting this build was to be able to inflict maximum ailment effect on everything, including Uber bosses. Why is that so important? Well, first and foremost because I want to and it sounds cool. Practically speaking, a full 6% brittle is great for this build, because it nearly doubles my crit chance. The 6% crit from brittle is added to the 6.3% local crit from my dagger, before global crit chance modifiers are applied. Sapping enemies by 20% translates to 25% more effective HP for this character. Lastly, despite dealing primarily chaos damage, scorching enemies for 30% elemental resistance is actually useful for this build, because more hit damage means stronger ailments, as we'll see shortly. If you've tried to scale non-damaging ailment effect before, you probably know that the effect of a non-damaging ailment is based on what percentage of maximum life the hit deals with its associated damage type. Well, not exactly. It's technically based on something called an ailment threshold, not on maximum life. It used to be based on maximum life, until GGG made bosses easier to inflict with ailments. An ailment threshold is simply a target's effective maximum life strictly for the purpose of calculating ailments and other max life-based effects like Fortify and Cruelty. The overwhelming majority of monsters in the game have ailment thresholds that are simply equal to their maximum life, but for bosses it's significantly lower than that. For instance, map bosses have ailment thresholds equal to roughly half their maximum life. For Shaper Guardians it's about 20%, and for Pinnacle bosses it's about 10%. If the effect of an ailment is based on the ratio of damage dealt to ailment threshold, then the obvious solution to scaling ailments is to simply deal more damage. Dealing more damage already has its obvious benefits, and then that leads to stronger ailments, which, depending on your ailments of choice, could lead to better survivability and or even more damage. It's a win-more situation. However, it turns out that ailment effect scales pretty poorly with damage. Here's the formula for chill effect. Here, D is damage dealt and T is ailment threshold. The 0.4 power on the damage factor means that in order to double your chill effect, you need to deal 5.66 times as much cold damage with your hit. To triple your chill effect, you need nearly 16 times as much damage. All non-damaging ailments have similar formulas, where they scale sublinearly with damage dealt. Does this mean you shouldn't prioritize damage? Of course not. It just means you should try to complement your damage with direct modifiers to ailment effect. My Molten Strike has 180% increased effect of non-damaging ailments. This comes from a number of places, starting with Awakened Unbound Ailment support, which gives 70% increased effect of non-damaging ailments. I get another 30% from a boot suffix, 10% from anomalous volatility, and 70% on crit from a crit mastery and a cluster dual passive. On top of all the increased ailment effect, I get 48% more effect of non-damaging ailments from the 6 affliction charges I mentioned earlier. Because this is more effect and not increased effect, the 1.48 multiplier from affliction charges is multiplicative with the 2.8 multiplier from increased modifiers. Finally, I have the Fury of Nature Ascendancy notable, which only comes from Forbidden Flesh and Forbidden Flame on a Ranger. Fury of Nature grants 100% more effect of non-damaging ailments, and causes non-damaging ailments to proliferate to nearby enemies. Altogether, these modifiers result in an ailment effect multiplier of 8.288. To put this number in perspective, in order to get this kind of ailment effect by simply doing more damage, one would need to deal 198 times as much damage. Or, in other words, this build inflicts non-damaging ailments as though dealing 19,700% more damage. In more practical terms, Uber Shaper has an ailment threshold of about 7.4 million. Without any investment into ailment effect, in order to inflict Scorch, Brittle, and Sap with maximum effect, I would need to hit him for about 28% of his ailment threshold, or about 2 million damage in a single hit. Given that this is a poison build, and that Uber Shaper has a 70% less damage taken modifier, 2 million damage in one hit is not realistic. However, with all of my ailment effect investment, I only need to deal about 10,500 damage with a hit to max out the ailments. This doesn't sound like a tough bar to hit, but according to Path of Building, my average melee hit against Uber Shaper is under 10,500, and I'm only able to get to 10,500 with the top end of my damage range. It turns out that the build just does fuck all for hit damage. I've specifically avoided using the Deadly Ailments support gem because of its 80% less damage with hits multiplier, but that only goes so far. Perfect Agony's 30% less damage with hits modifier is only partially offset by its enabling of crit multi-scaling. There are some ways to scale my ailment effect further, such as replacing vicious projectiles with a harder hitting support gem, or using Painseeker gloves, but Neither of those is palatable to me, and luckily I'm able to get maximum ailment effect anyway. Here we can see Ubershaper getting a full 30% Scorch, 6% Brittle, and 20% Sap using my current setup. In addition to scaling alternate ailments, I actually utilize Chill and Shock too. Leadership's Price prevents me from applying Chill and Shock, but this doesn't apply to Chilled Ground and Shocked Ground. Consequently, I bind Vortex to left-click for Chilled Ground and use Vol Lightning Trap for Shocked Ground. I have more than enough ailment effect to hit 50% Shock and 30% Chill, so these are worth the 2 gem sockets even with unreliable uptime. Here we can see the Crusader boss affected by all 5 non-damaging ailments at maximum effect. Whether it's worth building around ailment effect for a Poison Molten Strike build is debatable, given that it takes an amulet, a belt, and 2 jewel sockets. I think it's worth it. I'm getting a ton of damage and effective HP from these ailments, and both the belt and the amulet have other benefits for the build than just ailment effect. Also, it's cool, and I do what I want. On the defensive side, my survivability largely revolves around the combo of the unique shield, Mahuxotl's Machination, and the Tempered by War keystone. I have 4,300 maximum life, which is by far the lowest I've ever had on a character above level 95, let alone at level 100. However, we're long past the days of max life being a reliable indicator of overall survivability. Despite the low life total, this build feels very tanky. Against pinnacle bosses, Path of Building shows 29k max hit for physical damage, 84k for elemental, and 76k for chaos. These figures are without Fortify or Steelskin active. I didn't feel comfortable checking those boxes because these buffs aren't always up when needed. I do have Fortify in the build, but since I'm a poison build, I don't hit hard enough against some bosses to reliably maintain fortification stacks. Steelskin is linked to cast when damage taken instead of being self-cast, so it doesn't feel right factoring in the extra 2200 HP into my max hit values. For clearing packs of monsters, it's more reasonable to check the Fortify and Steelskin boxes, putting my effective hit pool in PoB at 221k. Note that this figure also factors in evasion and block, which is fair for clearing packs. So how does Mahuxotl's Machination enable this? I don't want to spend 20 minutes talking about this shield, so I'll try my best to summarize what this shield does for my build specifically. It grants 6 different keystones, applying a bunch of transformative effects to the character, some of which partially cancel each other out. Per the wiki, here is a list showing the net effect of all the keystones on this shield. Because of the shield, I can't regenerate life, but I can recharge life, and my leech is not removed on full life. When I'm on full life, my life leech recovers energy shield instead. On the topic of energy shield, I get 15% of max life as max ES, but all damage bypasses ES, making it useless as an HP buffer. However, thanks to Everlasting Sacrifice, when my ES fills, it resets to 0, but grants me 5% to all maximum resistances for 4 seconds. Maintaining the extra maximum resistances is more difficult than you may think. By default, one can't leech more than 10% of max ES per second. Combined with the 5% ES drain per second from the shield, it takes a minimum of 20 seconds to fill the ES bar, meaning uptime on the max resists is at most 20% of the time. The best way for me to solve this problem is to get 10% instant leech from the Leech Mastery, which allows me to gain up to 1% of my max life as ES on hit. I have enough hit DPS that I'm able to maintain good uptime on the max resists, even against bosses. There's still a lot more to Mahuxotl's Machination. Because it has Divine Flesh, it also causes me to take 50% of elemental damage as chaos damage, and raises my max chaos resist by 5%. This has 2 benefits. First, if my chaos resistance is higher than my elemental resistances, this just means I take less damage. Secondly, and this is an underrated aspect of Divine Flesh, taking elemental damage as chaos damage means elemental penetration is less effective against me. The portion of elemental damage taken as chaos does not benefit from monsters' elemental penetration. Now let's look at how Tempered by War factors in. Tempered by War is a keystone obtained through the Lethal Pride Timeless Jewel. This is significant because currently the combo of Divine Flesh and Tempered by War is only possible with Mahuxotl's Machination. Without the shield, the only way to get Divine Flesh is with the Glorious Vanity Timeless Jewel, and since you can't use more than one Timeless Jewel, you can't also get Tempered by War. Tempered by War causes me to take 50% of cold and lightning damage as fire damage, with the apparent downside of making it much harder to cap cold and lightning resistance. However, when combined with Divine Flesh, all cold and lightning damage is taken as fire and chaos damage. Furthermore, because these modifiers don't specify that they only apply to damage from hits, they also work on cold and lightning damage over time. Because I'm completely unable to take cold and lightning damage, I can safely neglect all sources of cold and lightning resistance. Additionally, because I take no cold or lightning damage, I'm completely unaffected by cold and lightning penetration. This utterly trivializes any damage that relies on cold or lightning penetration and has no fire or chaos penetration. For example, the Shaper's Frostbolt projectiles have 25% cold penetration, and Uber Shapers have 40% cold penetration. These do hardly any damage at all to me. The flip side is that giving monsters fire or chaos penetration, for example through Expedition Remnants, can be sketchy. With all damage taken being physical, fire, or chaos, I can focus on mitigating just those damage types. The goal here is to have 90% fire resistance and 90% chaos resistance. Luckily, that's not hard to do. I'm already at 85% chaos resistance from Divine Flesh and Everlasting Sacrifice, so I only need 5% max chaos resistance from other sources. One such source is an Honored Tattoo of the Makanga, which grants plus 2% to all maximum resistances. This can only be used with 8 adjacent passives allocated, restricting it to only a handful of viable locations on the tree. The last 3% max chaos resistance comes from the Born of Chaos Cluster Jewel notable. Next, I need 90% max fire resistance. With the 5% from Everlasting Sacrifice and the 2% from the Tattoo, I need 8% more from other sources. I use a level 20 Purity of Fire with 25% increased aura effect to get 5%, and the last 3% comes from Leadership's Price. Normally, Leadership's Price is expensive to get a great roll on, but since this build doesn't care about lightning or cold damage, I only care about the maximum fire resistance roll. With 90% fire and chaos resistance, the next step is to solve physical damage. For that, I try to stack as many physical damage taken as fire modifiers as I can. I get 40% from Cloak of Flame, which works against both hits and dots. Against hits only, I have 15% from my helmet, 10% from Watcher's Eye, and 15% from my Lethal Pride. Altogether, that's 80% of physical damage from hits taken as fire, and 40% of physical damage over time taken as fire. With 80% of physical damage taken as fire, 90% fire resistance, and a juiced up Ruby Flask, this is enough mitigation to just barely tank Uber Shaper slams. I have no armor or other sources of physical damage reduction, so the 20% that remains as physical damage can still hit pretty hard. If I want to increase my max hit further, the best way would be to take even more physical damage as non-physical damage. I'll go into more detail later about how I could achieve this, but every avenue is expensive, and ultimately I don't think that this is a problem that needs to be solved. I don't really need to be tanking Uber Shaper slams, that's only for limit testing. It's time for the remaining defensive layers. On top of mitigation from resistances and the 20% damage reduction from sap, I also have capped spell suppression and an additional 6% to spell suppression's damage reduction, meaning I take 56% less damage from spells and the ailments they inflict. I get Fortify on hit from an Honored Tattoo of the Paw, which replaces a plus 30 strength node on the tree. As I mentioned earlier, Fortify isn't reliably up against big bosses, but it's still worth it for the extra survivability while clearing. I believe it's possible to make Fortify a bit more reliable by using the aggressive defense notable on a large cluster jewel. If this works like I think it does, then the 60% increased fortification gain from the notable should make it easier to hit the threshold for gaining 1 fortification, meaning I'm much more likely to be able to stack it against big bosses. You can see in some of these clips that I'm sometimes able to generate a handful of fortification against Guardians and Pinnacle bosses, and against Uber bosses I occasionally get 1 or 2 fortification. Perhaps aggressive defense could help. I haven't tested this, so I don't know. I never feel comfortable with mitigation alone, and always want some avoidance layers on top of that. I can't fit in Grace with this build, which limits my ability to scale evasion, but it's still worth getting enough evasion that I won't get hit by consecutive attacks. This is achieved primarily through a Jade Flask and whatever evasion I can get on gear. Cloak of Flame doesn't have any evasion, so I'm only at about 12,000 evasion rating. I have no sources of blind and don't use Dread Banner, so enemies are at full accuracy. Still, the 12,000 evasion makes a big difference and makes me more confident when tanking, say, Expedition encounters. Other avoidance layers include 26% attack block from my shield and 25% spell block from Tempest Shield. As for recovery, I rely primarily on Leech and life gain on hit to restore my life. I already mentioned the 10% instant Leech mastery, which allows me to recover up to 43 life instantly from each hit. In addition to that, I've allocated the Excess Sustenance cluster, which gives me an average of 40 life gained on hit. Given the volume of projectiles I'm outputting, the combination of instant Leech and life on hit provides extremely fast recovery. I'm unable to regenerate life, but I have enough recovery on hit that it's very difficult for me to die as long as I'm hitting things. Because my life leech isn't removed on full life, I can continue to recover 20% of max life per second for 4.5 seconds out of combat, which helps counteract the physical damage over time from Blood Rage. Since Blood Rage is on my weapon, I can turn it off with a quick weapon swap, allowing me to recharge my life after 2 seconds. You may notice that I'm not using a life flask with this build. I found the preventive nature of utility flasks to be more reliable than a reactive life flask, especially for a Pathfinder who gets a lot of mileage out of utility flasks. I don't have any mitigation specifically for damage over time, but the high resistances and the 40% physical dot taken as fire make it tankier than most builds against dots. Still, dots are probably the most dangerous threats in Pinnacle boss fights. In particular, ground dot effects like the ones from the Cortex boss or from Maven Witnesses can do damage very quickly. They're particularly annoying when coupled with action speed slows. The best way to improve my dot mitigation is to use Lethi's Shade. It's 6 skill points to get to it from where I am currently, so it's better to use the tattoo that changes keystones to try and get Lethi's Shade on either Ghost Dance or Acrobatics. If I were interested in improving this build further, this is probably what I would do first. Lastly, let's go over immunities. I'm immune to stuns while clearing, thanks to the stun avoidance from the Heart of Oak cluster and the conditional stun avoidance from my boot enchantment. I can still be stunned during boss fights, but stun immunity is less important for those. I have 119% reduced curse effect from my juiced up ruby flask. This is enough curse reduction that even when my despair with 10% increased curse effect gets reflected back to me, I'm still unaffected by the curse. I also have the poison mastery that prevents enemies I poison from dealing critical strikes. This doesn't have quite the same reliability as stacking reduced extra crit damage modifiers, but for 1 skill point this is a much more efficient way to get crit reduction. For immunity to corrupted blood, that's coming from a corruption on one of my medium cluster jewels. I bought maybe 50 of these jewels for 10 to 20 chaos each and vol-orbed them all. If my math is right, then CB immunity is a 1 in 84 chance, so I got a bit lucky this time. I am not completely immune to elemental ailments. I get chill immunity from my boots, freeze immunity from Soul of the Brine King, and shock immunity from Tempest Shield. I'm not ignite immune, but with 90% fire resistance I haven't found this to be a problem. I'm also not immune to any of the alternate ailments, but this doesn't really matter either. My Ruby Flask overcaps my fire resistance by enough to negate Scorch, and Brittle is inconsequential because my poison disables enemy crits. As for Sap, I'm happy to just take the L on the rare occasion that this happens to me. Having my damage lowered by 20% won't get me killed, and there are very few things in the game that will cause me to be sapped anyway. Lastly, I do not have immunity to bleeding or poison, but I do have the Rolaketh Pantheon power that causes me to not take extra damage from bleeding while moving. With this, and the fact that 40% of physical dots are taken as fire, I don't even notice bleeding when it happens to me. As for poison, my only defense against that is 90% chaos resistance, but do I really need any more than that? On to the passive tree. This is probably the most compact skill tree I've ever had. There's so much good stuff in the vicinity of the ranger's starting area that I don't need to venture far beyond it. I'll try to highlight the important stuff here. Let's start with the Ascendancy tree. Master Toxicist causes poison to spread from dying enemies, which is the only thing that enables this build to clear maps efficiently. After playing this build, I don't think there are many skills I'd be willing to play as a poison build without also going Pathfinder. It's just so satisfying to be able to attack one time and clear packs, or to watch entire expeditions melt while proliferating ailments from their corpses. Nature's Adrenaline is what allows me to passively generate flask charges and maintain flask uptime during boss fights. Nature's Reprisal allows me to apply Wither simply by attacking, and makes Wither stronger, resulting in an enormous damage multiplier. Lastly, Nature's Boon buffs my 4 magic flasks, on which I heavily rely for my damage and defenses. On the main skill tree, I have some investment into Flask Sustain, both in the Careful Conservationist cluster and in a medium cluster jewel that grants Brood for Potency and Spiked Concoction. Because I'm not using a rare belt, I'm not able to get the valuable flask affixes in that slot. This means solving the Flask Sustain issue is quite a bit harder for this build than most Pathfinder builds. These 2 clusters on the tree, combined with Overflowing Chalice, provide the necessary sustain. I also have 2 tattoos for flask duration, but they may no longer be necessary now that I have 28% quality flasks. I may be able to swap the flask tattoos out for some max life tattoos now. Another important thing about the skill tree is that it's giving me 4 additional Molten Strike projectiles. Multi-Shot gives attack skills 1 additional projectile, and Fan of Blades on my cluster jewel gives another one for dagger and claw skills. The other 2 projectiles come from 2 tattoos of the Ramakoma Conga. Each one requires 7 adjacent allocated passives, which was easy right next to Perfect Agony because I was already allocating all those nodes anyway. The other spot required allocating 2 additional nodes, one of which was totally useless, but it was still worth it in the end. Some of the masteries allocated are pretty important for making the build function. As I mentioned earlier, the 10% Instant Leech mastery is necessary to maintain uptime on Everlasting Sacrifice. The Attack mastery granting 1 additional strike was pivotal until I was able to get +2 strikes on my gloves. Now the mastery is more of a quality of life thing. It still significantly accelerates my clearing speed. I also want to once again highlight the crit mastery that gives 50% increased effect of non-damaging ailments I inflict with crits. I get enormous value out of my lethal pride jewel. In addition to tempered by war, I get 15% of physical damage taken as fire. On top of that, there's a ton of flat strength on the small nodes. Given the tattoo system and the necessity of balancing my top 2 attributes for leadership's price, the additional strength makes gearing a lot easier. My other unique jewels are the Forbidden Flesh and Flame I use to get Fury of Nature, and a Watcher's Eye. The Watcher's Eye grants 10% of physical damage taken as fire while affected by Purity of Fire, and a bunch of crit chance while affected by Wrath. My only rare jewels are my 4 cluster jewels. On my large cluster, I have Feed the Fury for a bunch of attack speed and damage, in addition to Fan of Blades. One medium cluster is the previously mentioned Flask Duration cluster. The other medium cluster is a crit cluster, with Hemorrhage and Eye of the Storm. Eye of the Storm may seem like an odd choice since I can't use the Ignite modifier on it. However, 20% ailment effect on crit and 40% crit chance are enough to make it worth it despite the dead mod. The small cluster is a 2 passive Chaos Resist cluster with Born of Chaos, which I talked about earlier. Every plus 10 attribute node on my tree has some sort of tattoo on it. In addition to what I've already said about tattoos, I use a lot of plus 4 all attribute tattoos to meet attribute requirements and to balance attributes for leadership's price. With the remaining 5 nodes, I tattoo 2% increased maximum life. This build has a pretty low max life total, so the 10% from 5 tattoos is valuable. Next up is gear, starting with my weapon. My pneumatic dagger has 2 local elemental damage modifiers, Tier 1 and Tier 3, and a local attack speed mod. It's then multi-modded with chaos.multi and hits can't be evaded, which allows me to forgo all accuracy investment and trivialize all modifiers to enemy evasion. The shield slot is reserved for Mahuxotl's Machination, so there's no flexibility there. The only improvement would be to get a corrupted version of the shield. There aren't many useful outcomes from corruption, but one in particular would be huge. More on that later. My Cloak of Flame is one with a high fire resist roll and a corruption for 46% increased damage. One perk of using a cheap unique body armor is that it's not hard to find corrupted versions on the market, and sockets and links aren't difficult to fix with tainted currency. My helmet, boots, and gloves are all rare. The helmet has the Molten Strike enchantment for 2 additional projectiles. It also has life, spell suppression, intelligence, chaos resistance, and 15% physical damage taken as fire. The gloves implicits were crafted with Orbs of Conflict to get the exquisite mod for plus 2 strikes. The affixes are life, spell suppression, attack speed, fire and chaos resistance, and 43% increased damage while leeching. The enchantment triggers Commandment of Spite when I get hit, which gives me another source of chilled ground. The boots have life, spell suppression, movement speed, chill immunity, chaos resistance, and 30% increased ailment effect. Next, jewelry. My leadership's price is anointed with Sovereignty, which gives me some extra reservation efficiency and boosts my increased aura effect to 26%, which is enough to hit a breakpoint for Purity of Fire where I get an additional max fire resistance from it. One of my rings is a synthesized ring with Onslaught on hit. I crafted it with Essences of Torment until I got something usable, which in this case is Tier 1 life, Tier 3 chaos resistance, Tier 1 all attributes, and an open prefix for the Elrion mana cost craft. The second ring is a Vermilion ring with life, elemental damage, chaos resistance, and crafted attributes. There is an open suffix, but there aren't many good outcomes, and I don't want to risk exalting an attribute that makes balancing my attributes more difficult. Last, but certainly not least, I have a double corrupted Alessia's Delight, with what I believe are the best 2 implicits for my build. 8% increased max life, and 20% increased wrath effect. The belt with the corruption cost me only 1 divine in week 3 of the league. Again, finding stuff like this is a perk of playing homebrew builds that nobody else plays. I did the lab running myself to get the Wither enchant, which is a surprising amount of DPS you can squeeze out of a belt enchantment. There aren't many ways to lower enemy chaos resistance outside of the Despair Curse, so the extra 6% is very nice to have. My flasks are all utility flasks, starting with Overflowing Chalice, which is needed to get 100% uptime on my other flasks. The Diamond Flask gives me nearly 300% increased crit chance, pushing me over 90%. The Ruby Flask makes me virtually curse immune, and makes me take 38% less fire damage. Given that 80% of physical damage and 50% of cold and lightning damage are taken as fire, it can't be overstated how valuable the damage reduction from the Ruby Flask is. The Jade Flask provides the majority of my evasion, while the Quartz Flask gives me permanent phasing, caps my spell suppression, and gives me a bunch of attack speed. My main links are Phantasmal Molten Strike, linked to Awakened Vicious Projectiles, Awakened Unbound Ailments, Awakened Elemental Damage with Attacks, Anomalous Volatility, and Awakened Multi-Strike. The gem I want to highlight here is Volatility. It's a great support gem for this build for a couple of reasons. First, Volatility is great with builds with high damage variance. Since this build scales primarily lightning damage, its damage range is very wide, making the less minimum attack damage modifier on the gem pretty inconsequential. Second, increasing the top end of my damage in particular is especially important for this build, because the hardest hit will apply the strongest ailments. The anomalous version of the gem has the additional benefit of 10% increased non-damaging ailment effect. In one 4-link, I have Vol Lightning Trap, Life Tap, Despair, and Frost Blink. The Vol Lightning Trap is in a white socket, so that I can swap it out for Vol Blade Flurry if I want to. Vol Blade Flurry grants 50% less damage taken while channeling, which is something I can use defensively to tank a big telegraphed hit like the Uber Shaper Slam. Here you can see the difference between when I press Vol Blade Flurry and when I don't. A quick note, my links here show Frost Blink even though I'm using Flame Dash in all the clips in the video. Frost Blink is probably superior to Flame Dash for this build, and I've swapped to Frost Blink since recording this video. I generally gravitate toward Flame Dash because it has multiple charges, but Frost Blink has several advantages. First, Frost Blink always being instant makes it feel better to use while using Molten Strike or Rolling Blades. Second, Frost Blink creates chilling ground, making it less clunky to apply 30% chill to bosses than relying on Vortex and Commandment of Frost. Another 4-link contains Purity of Fire, Wrath, and Divergent Herald of Agony, linked to Enlighten. The final 4-link is Vortex, Tempest Shield, Whirling Blades, and faster attacks. On my shield is my cast when damage taken setup with Steel Skin and Life Tap. Lastly, I have Anomalous Blood Rage and Phantasmal Ancestral Protector linked to a level 4 Enhance. Anomalous Blood Rage is pivotal because at 40% quality, I have a 4% chance to gain a Frenzy charge on hitting a unique enemy. Given the number of projectiles I fire, this is enough to reliably generate Affliction charges in boss encounters. Before I had the Anomalous Blood Rage setup, I was using a Precursor's emblem with Frenzy charge on hit, but it's nice not to have to dedicate a ring slot to that anymore. As always, it's time to talk about potential improvements to the build. I believe the build is pretty min-maxed at this point, so this section will be shorter than usual. The single most impactful and least risky upgrade I could make would be to use Journey Tattoos of the Makanui to tattoo Lethe Shade onto either Acrobatics or Ghost Dance. Yes, this would be expensive, depending on RNG, but it requires no complicated changes to the build, and addresses the weakest link in its survivability. Speaking of Ghost Dance, I've just come to a realization while typing this script. Why am I not simply allocating Ghost Dance? I dismissed it when initially planning the build because my ES isn't actually giving me HP, so Ghost Dance wouldn't help my survivability. However, you may notice in some of the boss clips that my ES can sometimes take longer than I'd like to fill up, because incoming damage makes it difficult to keep my life full and leech to ES. With the amount of evasion rating I have, Ghost Dance would generate 379 ES when I get hit, every 2 seconds on average. That would pretty much completely solve any issues I have with maintaining uptime on Everlasting Sacrifice. It's a little embarrassing that I hadn't thought of it until now, but I've just made the change to the build and it's definitely an improvement. Another change that could be made, and I alluded to this earlier, is getting more physical damage taken as modifiers to improve my physical mitigation. I'm already able to tank Uber Shaper Slams, but only barely. It's possible to make them completely trivial, but it's not easy to get there from here. One way would be to corrupt either physical damage taken as fire or physical damage taken as chaos, or both, onto my shield. Given the price of the shield, I estimate this endeavor would cost a few hundred divines on average, so I decided not to commit to it. I've gone through the ordeal of throwing dozens of copies of a unique at the Locus of Corruption before, and I think I'd rather just do something else. Another option would be to use Taste of Hate. This is extraordinarily difficult for this build because my cold resistance is currently negative. I don't take any cold damage, but Taste of Hate would cause me to take cold damage from physical hits. This option only makes sense if I can cap my cold resistance. With a better roll on Leadership's Price, I can have 85% max cold resistance. However, Tempered by War makes me have 50% less cold resistance, meaning that to get to 85%, I would need a total of plus 290% cold resistance. I already get 50% from my belt, and Taste of Hate itself would give me 66%, but that still leaves a lot of investment to get the rest of it. Also, Taste of Hate would most likely be taking the spot of my Jade Flask, so I'd lose the majority of my evasion in the process. I could use Orbs of Conflict to get an additional 1% of physical damage taken as fire on my helmet. That's pretty easy to do, and I should probably just do it. Nonetheless, getting significantly more than 81% physical damage taken as requires some pretty costly alterations to the build, for a problem that only exists if I play like a moron and tank Shaper Slams, and even then I'll probably still survive. I think that's all the technical stuff I have to say about the build. Overall, I'm pretty pleased with how it turned out. I've been learning to do Uber bosses with this character, and it's been going quite well. Uber Exarch was pretty rough, but I think that's more of a skill issue than anything. Uber Cirrus was a similar story, and I think that's compounded by the fact that melee builds don't have good places to stand in that fight while still doing damage. Uber Shaper, Uber Elder, Uber Maven, and Uber Cortex have all been fine after learning their mechanics a bit. I haven't yet attempted Uber Eater of Worlds, but I think that would be one of the easier fights for this build. As for what happens next, I'm not sure yet. I've got about 100 Divines to work with, thanks in large part to an Apothecary pulled from a stacked deck. That's more than enough to get the next build going, whatever it may be. If you've got any feedback for the build or other videos you'd like to see me make, let's have a conversation in the comments. As always, if I need to make any technical corrections, I'll pin a comment with them included, so check for that if you haven't yet. Thanks for watching.